Welcome to the Democracy's College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu.
Thank you so much. We are here with Dr. Gina A. Garcia. Dr. Garcia is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where she teaches in the Higher Education Management program. Her research centers on issues of diversity in higher education, with an emphasis on Hispanic-serving institutions, HSIs, and Latino students. Dr. Garcia herself is also a proud graduate of an HSI. Welcome this afternoon, Dr. Garcia.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you joining us on Democracy's College for OCCRL. Dr. Garcia, much of your work argues that context matters. What do you consider the central components of institutional culture that are necessary to enhance the success of students of color?
There's a lot of work out there that says that the curriculum that we offer to students and the co-curricular aspects of a college experience are important for all students. But my work digs in a little bit deeper, and that I'm looking specifically at not only racialized students, but also racialized contexts. So does this look different in an HSI or an emerging HSI or, a minority serving institution, any type of minority serving institution, than it would at a predominantly white institution? What I'm finding is that those spaces continue to matter, and those spaces include Greek organizations, ethnic student organizations, diversity training, workshops, stuff like that, internship programs that students participate in. Those types of things have been coming out as significant spaces, contexts for students, and particularly students of color, and that those kind of spaces contribute to their leadership development, that they're able to develop as leaders and start to see leadership as more complex than just positional based on those experiences. Also, I've done some work with one of my grad students, Oscar Patron, and we have looked at how those types of spaces help students get through difficult situations, often oppressive situations where they enact their resilience, and that those kind of spaces allow them to sort of be who they are and explore who they are, whether it be racially or their sexual orientation or their immigration status, and that they find those spaces to be super important. I think as far as thinking more specifically about like HSIs or emerging HSIs versus PWIs, predominantly white institutions, in doing some comparative work and having two different samples in my study on Latino male leadership, it definitely became important that HSIs seem to have those spaces more often, right? So the HSI and the emergent HSI in my study, there were a lot more spaces for students to explore. There were a lot more sources of like in the curriculum, right, where they could take like ethnic studies programs or they could participate in like ethnic student organizations than we found at the predominantly white institution. So that was really powerful for us, was to be like, well, in the empirical research, we're saying, yeah, these spaces matter, but also are institutions actually offering these spaces? And not to say that predominantly white institutions can't and don't offer those spaces, because they do. But in my particular study, they weren't offering those. And so students were struggling to find those spaces because they weren't there. So I think it's just to put back, the onus on the institution of, you got to provide these spaces for students, right? Like we can't just continue to bring in minoritized students and expect them to succeed without actually thinking about the things that they need.
I want to piggyback on when you mentioned the differences per se in terms of HSIs in contrast to emerging HSIs as well as non-HSIs. So when you think about the spaces and that they're more readily available where students can find space and place to see themselves reflected, not just in the curriculum, but also in that which is co-curricular at HSIs and emerging HSIs. How does that translate into student outcomes?
Really, if I think about my research trajectory and where I really started with thinking about HSIs and to where it is now, that was like early question that I had of like, okay, so to be an HSI means that you enroll at least 25% or more Latino students. And so then therefore it's just matters, percent just matters, right? Like that's all that matters is that the certain percentage is there, and therefore, maybe it leads to different outcomes. But the early work that I did along those lines, quantitative work to really look at like outcomes and graduation rates at 4-year HSIs and emerging HSIs and non-HSIs, basically showed that it didn't matter, that the percentage of Latino students on college campus doesn't predict whether students will graduate. But the strongest predictors were those that we know, which is institutional selectivity and institutional resources. When I think about that and the importance of us having bigger conversations, particularly at the like federal level and the state level, as far as like, if we know that that's what's going to be, those variables predict outcomes, then how do we support institutions, right? How do we make sure that we continue to support HSIs and even more, right? Because we know that we have to account for the fact that they are maybe under-resourced or less selective institutions, and that they need the support. Thinking about HSIs not just as the percentage of Latino students or Latino faculty and staff on campus, but like how do we come to support them no matter what the percentage is? Because it's bigger, right? There's bigger issues and institutional level factors that we got to think about.
One of the things I'd like to spend some time exploring with you is the consideration of organizational identity. How do HSIs further the matriculation for Latina students and, students of color in general? Because on one hand, you have minority serving institutions that say, for instance, tribal colleges or HBCUs, that organic in the mission and origination of those institutions was embedded a vision of value, again, a mission of advancing equitable student outcomes for those particular student groups. Whereas with predominantly Black institutions or HSIs, they are much more enrollment driven as opposed to mission driven. What type of cultural congruence would you say in terms of your work have you seen? Is there a greater person environment fit for Latino students or students of color in general at HSIs?
I'm really grappling with this question right now with my current study. I'm working on a multiple case study. I have 3 institutions in the same city in Chicago, Illinois, and they are all HSIs on paper, but they function very differently. They look very different, and institutionally, they're just different, like as far as size and public versus private and how much they fund students versus not. And so they're very, very different institutions on the fact that they enroll, at least 25% Latino students. It's interesting because I'm finding so many different things as far as like, what does it actually mean to be an HSI? I think about HSI identity, like the salience, right? Like how salient is it to people? And I have one institution that's very salient. They've been thinking about it for over 20 years, that they're actually an HSI, and they have a good number of these like different contexts that I, have mentioned. Like they have a Latino resource center, and they have an offsite campus that is particularly caters to the Latino community in the area. And so they're very much aware of it. They're doing all these things, but their outcomes are probably the lowest of the 3. Whereas the institution at the opposite end, where their salience is very low, they haven't thought about themselves as an HSI at all. I think my presence might be bringing it to their consciousness more than anything. They have very high outcomes for students. With that institution, it's not that they're not thinking about that population. They are. Because when I dig in deeper, it's a private institution, and they're funding students in important ways. That they're like making sure that students who are maybe low income or undocumented, that they're getting funding, and they're finding different sources of funding for them, right? And they see funding as a really important thing for this population. They're not doing it because they're an HSI. They're doing it because they recognize the need of this population, right? And so it becomes, again, this sort of conundrum of like, well, does that mean they're serving this population well, right? Whether or not they actually accept the federal designation or the federal designation is salient to them doesn't mean that they are serving students more or less, right? That they're serving the population, and they recognize that the population is there, but they just do it because they recognize it, right? As opposed to because of them being an HSI. And talking to students at that particular site it's interesting because they also don't even realize that they don't have the contexts, that they don't have a Latino resource center, that they don't have, Chicano studies in the curriculum, like those sort of things. They actually don't even realize that they're missing it because it's just not there. But in talking to them, they start to think like, well, yeah, actually that would be kind of cool, right? I would kind of like that. They just haven't had exposure to it because they just haven't, right? The institution hasn't offered it. And so I think I stand by like the research in that, like saying those things do matter, right? Those students might have a whole different experience and they're going to graduate. There's a part of me that really truly believes that creating critical consciousness in students and helping them to find their identity and explore their racial and ethnic identity and other identities while in college is important, right? That maybe graduating students in high numbers isn't enough, right? That HSIs should bring other things, right? Which goes back to your point about the mission, right? That like, yeah, that should be a mission, right? Like there should be a conversation about, you know, we're serving these different populations. How does that become part of our mission, right? How do we actually move towards being a minority serving institution or a Hispanic serving institution?
As you were talking about the 3 case studies and them all being embedded in Chicago, you know, the home for OCCRL is in Champaign at our flagship campus, U of I, but we also have offices in Chicago, and some of the work that we've done, if we were to release a video of this transcription, I would be showing up as a bobblehead because, you know, there's a lot of case and points in terms of some of the examples where we have interviewed and have surveyed faculty, and they didn't even realize they were at a minority serving institution.
Yes.
Students didn't realize that, and so on. But these are institutions that meet the federal designation, but don't necessarily ascribe to being one openly. And then others that wear it on their sleeve and are very, very much so in the tradition of advancing and sharing very explicitly that we are HSI,
right.
2-year institution. But some of your recent work has kind of underscored what you call Latinized institutions, right? You've coined this term Latinized institutions and have talked about the utilities of counter storytelling and describing such institutions. So could you share with our listeners a little bit more about this concept of Latinized institutions?
Yeah, so the idea of the Latinized institution, actually, I'm not gonna take credit for coining that. I actually have a friend here in Pittsburgh. Her name is Tara Sherry Torres, and she wrote about like, what if Pittsburgh was Latinized? And I thought, if a place where there's only 2% Latino people and where I feel like is not Latinized at all, and where they don't even see me as a person, as a Latina, could, you know, in our alternative world actually get to that space, why couldn't any institution get there as well, right? So I was really moved, and it was like a blog that she wrote, but I was moved by her blog to think about like, what would that look like for any space, any institution of higher ed to be Latinized, right? And so what I did with that, and that's a policy brief that I wrote for Center for Minority Serving Institutions, was use empirical data to write this alternative world. Right. And so that's this idea of counter storytelling, right? That you actually do use empirical data. So it's not made up. The story isn't fully fictional, but it is in some ways because it's still storytelling. It's a story, but it's based on real data. And so I was able to, from 2 of the 3 sites, because I hadn't collected data from all 3 sites yet in my current study, to write about what this alternative world look like. Right. And it was fun to write because I was able to pull from the 2 institutions and sort of mesh them into one, because I felt like one was very Latinized in one way and one was very Latinized in another way. And a lot of that had to do with culture and the way people felt and the use of language, and particularly the Spanish language. And so counter storytelling allowed me the opportunity to do that. And it's grounded in critical race theory. So just a quick little plug, I actually am writing a book, and the book will be written as counter stories. So all 3 institutions will actually, in the study, I'm telling counter stories about the 3 institutions. And again, it's based on the empirical data, but it will highlight the really important aspects of each of the institutions that makes them Latinized, right? And those are very different things. For each institution, it looks very, very different.
And thinking about some of your thoughts as it relates to the different pathways that HSIs provide underrepresented students of color, particularly, from our purview at OCCRL, we considered a pipeline of 2-year institutions that are MSIs as well. And can you share some of your thoughts about how community colleges can be used as conduits to advance Latina completion?
And it is something I'm thinking a lot about right now, particularly as I am working on my book, because I'm thinking about post-secondary institutions as a population, like as, all post-secondary institutions together. And I'm thinking a lot and writing about how we value only certain institutions in research and policy and practice. It's a handful of institutions, and they're the most elite institutions in the country, the ones that are on the top of the list of the best colleges and universities in the country. And if I say that, and if I ask I could go ask 10 people, walk outside, ask 10 people, and probably all 10 people would name at least 10 of the same, right? Of the top 50, at least 10, right? Like Harvard and University of Virginia, right? Like University of Illinois, right? Like, I mean, there's all these different, we all kind of think about the same institutions, right? And we value those institutions. And HSIs are not those institutions, and community colleges are not those institutions. And therefore, we don't value them, right? In the same sort of way that we value those institutions. And so I've been thinking a lot about the importance, and in line with this idea of counter storytelling, right? That all institutions don't have to be Harvard or whatever that institution is. Not all institutions have to be large research institutions or get grant money from the federal government for doing big research or recruit the top faculty in their field to come in and be scholars that do these sort of things or recruit students with the highest SAT or ACT scores. Like, that's not what all institutions are about, right? And the more I spend time with HSIs, the more I realize that those institutions actually don't want to be those institutions, right? They're like, yeah, no, that's not what we do, right? We don't do those things. And we actually don't even have a tenure process, right? Like, and that's okay, because we value teaching and we value, producing graduates that get to immediately go out into these high skill, high demand, high wage jobs, right? So 2 of my institutions are actually that. 2 of the 3 in my current study, that's what they do. They're focused on like hospitality management. They're focused on nursing programs, and healthcare is big, right? Like, and particularly for Latino population and bilingual students. There is a huge demand for people that can go out into the healthcare industry, and not doctors, right? Like people who can go out like immediately, like 2 years, get a degree, pharmaceuticals, right? Pharmaceutical techs, like immediately 2 years later, go out and get a good job in a high demand area. Social work is a big one in some of these institutions. They're like, we need people to go out and just work with our communities, right? People that are willing to go out and take action in our communities and help our communities, and to do it in a culturally relevant way, right? That they understand the population and they speak the language of the population that they're working with. And so I'm learning a lot from those 2 institutions, right? That those 2 institutions are like, yeah, we don't care about, they don't actually say they don't care about being Harvard or they don't want to be Harvard, but they do, right? Without saying it, they do. They're like, we're really good at these things, right? And we are graduating students, and they're going out and they're working with their communities, and they're uplifting their communities at the same time, right? One of my institutions talks about like intergenerational, like educational uplift, that like one person comes to the institution and then they get the aunt, and then they get the cousin, and then they get the daughter, and then all of a sudden the whole family is there, right? And now they're uplifting the entire community and the entire family, and that's valuable to them. And so I think it's just, it's something for us to ponder as researchers and policymakers, legislators, to think about what value do we place on community colleges and broad access institutions, because they bring so much value.
So as our time is wrapping up here, I want to ask, what advice would you provide if there were a call to action you would offer to those listening that want to take an equity-minded approach to broadening participation, that are considering how to foster pathways to and from HSIs and bolster student outcomes? What advice would you share?
That it kind of goes along with the last thing I was talking about, as far as like just rethinking our values, right? Like as a system, as a society, that in general, we value very white normative, heteronormative ways of being, right? And that's problematic, right? Because a lot of us don't just fall in line with those values or those ways of knowing or being. And so I think we have to really take a critical look at ourselves. And I recently wrote about the idea of decolonizing HSIs, right? And that has been powerful. I've presented that idea at several conferences, and people came up to me like, wow, I've never thought about it like this, and this is my life. I'm a director of Title V at my HSI, and this is so powerful for me to think about getting rid of all the layers of elitism, right? And all the things we value in post-secondary ed, and just getting to the core of what we can be good at, which is serving minoritized populations, right? And really understanding them and really just caring about their outcomes. beyond just academic outcomes, right? Like that there's other things that are important. That would be my call to action, to really think about how do we just, for those people that are familiar with this idea of decolonizing, right? And sort of embracing indigenous ways of knowing and not valuing colonized ways of knowing, right? Which is the normative ways of knowing and being, and just thinking about that. What would that actually look like? Again, it's like this alternative world, this Latinized world of like, it would be a different space, right? It would be a very different space, and it would require everybody to be on board with that, right? If you think at an institutional level, like how do you get an entire institution on board with that? It's going to take time, right? It definitely is going to take time. But I got people now, after giving these talks, that are asking me, well, how do we do it, right? Like we do want to do it. We have people committed to doing this. We have administrators committed to doing this. We have faculty committed to doing it, right? So I think that's my call to action. Is like, let's think about decolonizing institutions of higher ed.
With that said, I thank you so much for your time, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information about the retention, success, and identity development of Latina, Latino college students, we recommend you visit Dr. Garcia's faculty profile. For more podcasts, links to today's recommended resources, or to share your comments and suggestions, visit occrl.illinois.edu/democracy or send them via Twitter at OCCRL. Tune in next month when Gina A from OCCRL talks with the author of Illegal, Reflections of an Undocumented Immigrant, Jose Angel N., about his experiences as an undocumented immigrant navigating into and through higher education. Background music for this podcast is provided by DubLab. Thank you for listening and for your contribution to educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students.